Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in person as well as online. My name is David Phillips from ACC Carbon Capture. I'm the head of the UK and Investor Relations. I'm delighted to welcome a very distinguished panel of industry and also policy experts to discuss our talk today, or our discussion today, achieving net zero ambitions in hard-to-abate industries. Or really, how do you make a hard-to-abate industry a little bit less hard to abate? So we're going to look a little bit at the broad picture. We're going to talk about why these areas really are challenging in terms of being hard to abate. We're going to look at technical progress. We're going to look at where we are in the market right now. We're going to talk about how we can accelerate the decarbonisation of these hard-to-abate industries. And then at the end, we're going to have the classic sign-off comment from everyone. What does success look like? What if we meet in, I'm not quite sure which COP it'll be, but 2030 at least. I can't do the maths very easily. But when we meet in a few years' time, what hopefully will we have seen progress in those years? So as I mentioned, I'm delighted to be joined by such a distinguished group of colleagues and friends to talk to this. I will, rather than going through a long intro each, I'll just give you a very quick rundown. So we're delighted to have Edda Dottir from Carbfix as the CEO of Carbfix. Thank you for coming along and fighting the trains today. Jon Christoph Knudsen, JC, my colleague from ACC Carbon Capture, who's our Chief Commercial Officer. Anna Sardona from Bellona, I'm a policy expert, and also Mark Preston Aragonist from Bellona as well. So thank you everyone for joining me today. The run of play today, we're going to have a run of various topics and questions with the panel, but of course, none of us have seen before at all. And so it'll be a complete surprise to everyone. We'll go through that, and then we'll open to some questions in the room as well, which of course, there'll be a few planted, I'm sure, for us to discuss. So hard-to-abate sectors, we sort of decided we wanted to start from the top. So what exactly do we mean by this in the context of talking about net zero, hard to abate? The terms that get used sometimes a little bit loosely. So Mark, maybe if I start with you, what do we mean by a hard to abate sector?
Yes, that's a good question. I think it's something that needs to be explored a little bit, because hard to abate often refers to sectors that we don't have a solution for necessarily today, or that we didn't have a solution for yesterday, but that, with some technical innovation or even existing solutions that aren't approved, not approved, but aren't developed to the extent that they should be. They're considered to be hard to implement, and as a result, that sector is considered to be hard to abate. But we do have some solutions for those sectors that we might consider hard to abate, like cement and steel and chemicals, namely CCS. But I think also when it comes to net zero, which is part of the topic of the conversation today, net zero ambitions for hard to abate sectors, we need to look at what net zero means as well. Net zero means a balance between emissions and removals. And setting net zero targets is fine, as long as it's accompanied by transparent, clear pathways for emission reductions and removals that eventually meet somewhere in the middle. So it's a very good question about hard to abate sectors, and often they sound harder to abate than they actually are, and the label is not necessarily useful.
Yeah, we do look at the history of how these industries have progressed with decarbonisation. I mean, 10, 11, 12 years ago, when there was, let's say, maybe a less successful attempt to get the CCS industry up and running at speed, and there was potentially a lot of projects, admittedly a lot around coal and maybe some around gas-fired power, but not so much in these industries. Why do you think, and this may be an open question, but why do you think these industries like cement and steel and so on, why are they at the back of the queue? Why haven't they been addressed more aggressively so far? Maybe JC, if you have a...
Well, I think it's fair to say that they've been trying to address this, and of course it's if you look at the cement industry, as we've been working with for quite some time, they're really been researching a lot of different things. They've been trying to subsidize, how they actually fire up these cement kilns, and been trying to figure out other ways of actually creating the actual cement and the ingredients behind it. So I wouldn't say that they haven't been trying, but I think we need to come to the fact that some industries will be left with emissions that need to be addressed. Yeah. And if they cannot be addressed by energy efficiency and using other electrification and those type of things, then CCS and CCU will inevitably come to the question.
Yeah, and maybe Anna, just turning to you, and this, just in this sort of last question around setting the backdrop for the hard to abate theme, when you just putting it in the context of why it's important in net zero, and also how it links with the circular economy, how do you see that landscape fitting together?
Yeah, well, I think hard to abate sectors are, in fact, it's a misleading title. Actually, we have many ways to abate emissions from them. And the reason we haven't done it is because they're very large industries. So essentially you can change a light bulb in your home, but it's really difficult to decarbonize the steel mill. And the scale of that is really big. So hopefully the solutions that we have today and that the companies are indeed developing will be scaled up further on to reduce the emissions from the primary production. Another point where we need to sort of do more is the material efficiency in the economy itself. So essentially, we have two big categories of emissions reductions that we need to do. One is the actual decarbonization of the primary production at the steel mill, at the cement plant. And the other category is actually using those materials more efficiently. So if we can do more with less cemented steel, that would overall be very good for the material efficiency of the system. So just like we do energy efficiency, we should think about that as well. But yeah, I think the reason why it's really difficult is because these industries are quite large. They take a long time to change and to change their ways of production. We've been producing steel and cement in the same, in a similar way for hundreds of years. So of course, that is a big challenge, but the longer we wait, the harder it will be.
Absolutely. I think it's a good context in terms of them being more efficient alongside actually capturing the CCS slice. I think one of the famous IEA scenarios, I think the efficiency slice is actually a little bit larger if it's by long term than the CCS. CCS, what, 15-20%, something like that. And the energy efficiency side, if you can really go through all those steps, is materials. That's a great context. Thank you. So we've outlined a little bit of the backdrop and the challenge. And if we sort of dive down into a little bit more detail now in terms of, I mean, we sort of brushed across some of the challenges. And maybe Edda, start off in terms of the overall CCS machine. So storage has been a challenge, or at least some of the most important timelines that we can see in the next few years will obviously dictate how quickly some of these plans will progress. I mean, for your side, I mean, so there's obviously been a big step around storage that you've been part of. Maybe it's just worth, you never know that everyone maybe not heard of the great work you've been doing up in Iceland. Maybe a little bit of a comment around Carbfix and what you guys have been doing.
Yeah, so Carbfix, we've been working on developing our technology since 2006. And what we do is we take captured CO2, inject it underground, and basically in a similar way as has been done within the oil and gas sector for quite some time. But
I think you need to turn it on.
oh,
Sorry.
We have to shout a bit louder.
There it is.
okay, is it working now? Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Okay, I'll start again. Yeah, so Carbfix, we've been developing our technology since 2006. And basically what we do, we set out to develop a technology that allows us to imitate and accelerate a process that's already part of the natural carbon cycle. And the fact that actually the by far largest carbon reservoir on Earth is the bedrock underneath us is a fact that's not known by many. The bedrock underneath us stores over 200,000 times more carbon than all the other carbon storing mechanisms on our planet. And the carbon is found in minerals. So what we do, we actually take captured CO2, dissolve it in water, and this facilitates reactions happening between specific bedrock and the CO2 we inject. And in just 2 years, it turns to stone and becomes part of bedrock. So this is what we do. It's very similar in a sense to the supercritical storage of CO2, except we target other types of storage formations. So the two solutions complement one another very well and allow us to open up a larger area for possible storage sites. But with respect to storage, I wouldn't necessarily say it's sort of a bigger challenge than the capture and implementing new sectors and so forth. But if we are going to have robust storage sites, it takes time to develop them. So we have to start early and we like to do it gradually. So you don't jump into, I don't know, several million tons injection into a new injection site at once. You have to gradually develop it, learn the ropes of how you exploit it and safely store CO2 underground. So this is what we have to strategically approach. We have to if we're going to reach the scale we need in time, we have to develop a large number of new storage sites, meaning that we have to strategically start developing them now, more or less.
Yeah.
And the good news is the solutions exist. The capacity is absolutely there. The capture solutions are there. The transport solutions are there. So we have to get to work and do so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a very nice study recently by Edinburgh University, or a team up there, looking at really the state of play in CCS. And I think they estimated that at the current pace of project activity, the storage by 2050 will be a tiny fraction, I mean, less than a tenth of what you'd need to get to. So that obviously does not include the CARFIX concept, but just particularly with hard to abate sectors, how do you see your model? I'm thinking maybe also around the coda terminal and so on. How do you see your model being applicable to help the hard to abate sectors?
Well, as I say, we take captured CO2. It can be from the hard to abate sectors, and we are actually actively working, have actively been working with some of those sectors, because we have a big power intensive industry in Iceland that falls under this category, aluminum and ferrosilicon productions. So we take the CO2 and our solution, we can both do it on site, capture, and or somebody else can capture, we can inject on site, provided that there is a favorable storage formation. And a benefit of our technology is we can do it on land, because the CO2 mineralizes so rapidly. So if we have favorable storage sites on land, we can do it there. And this is what we've been doing in Iceland so far. And then we can also add a transport link in a similar way that's being done in other projects in Europe, like the Northern Lights or the Longboat project and the Porthos and so forth. And that's the coda terminal. That's the biggest project we are working on now. And the idea there is simply to open up Iceland and receive CO2 for CO2 mineral storage. And the hub is going to be located next to one of our big aluminum smelters, allowing for synergies between capturing CO2 from there and bringing it in from other places in Northern Europe and safely mineralize it in the subsurface.
Absolutely, that sounds great. Policy, I think Mark and Anna, so around the policy of working with these types of sectors, again, we talked a little bit at high level, but what are some of the most important developments you've seen so far, and what do you think the challenges are around working with these types of sectors?
Well, there's a lack of coherence when it comes to developing CO2 transport and storage networks. So in the EU at the moment, there isn't a sufficient the frameworks for funding these types of projects aren't appropriate at the moment. They only look at how to transport CO2 via pipeline, but they don't look at other ways of transporting it, and they don't look at the actual funding the storage. And obviously, there needs to be a more coherent approach. We have all these different steps along the way ready to be put together, as you mentioned, and we need to connect the dots. And at the moment, that's lacking. I'd say that's the biggest sort of bottleneck when it comes to the hard to abate sectors, is really access to CO2 transport and storage.
Anna?
If I could just add to that, I think these sectors are very large sectors that need a lot of different resources to decarbonize. So when we're looking at CCS, of course, that is CO2 transport and storage. So that's one of the biggest elements of the decarbonization for these industries, where there are bottlenecks. But then we also have, electricity use, for example. If we're going to electrify large plants, we need to build out renewables a lot in the coming years. So that will be one big bottleneck that we're currently facing, where I'm not seeing the EU step up properly. Another would be also sort of recognizing the true price of carbon. These industries have been getting free allocations for a very long time, and that should change. And these conversations are not happening a little bit with CBAM. So we're going to see that develop in a different way, probably in the next coming years. And I also think on the demand side, we need to also incentivize the sort of the usage of low carbon products. Consumers and businesses need to be aware of what they're buying. So how big of a footprint that product has, and they need to be incentivized and nudged into actually procuring and buying the low carbon products. So the cement and steel plant have a business case. So I think these elements are still something that is missing on the global and EU level.
Yeah, that's really, we've actually come on to that in the next round of questions. Actually, I think the idea of we talk a lot about blue hydrogen, but what about blue cement, blue steel, etc. That maybe is not as well discussed. But just while we stick into the challenges around the technical side, JC, I know amines are your second favorite topic, but what are the issues you see in terms of technology? Are there any particular barriers to dealing with these sectors? Is there any particular headache?
Yeah, what are the key?
Some endemic microphone issue.
Well, mine is actually on. I think coming back to Ada's comment, I think we're in the same boat. You know, this technology has been around for pretty much the same amount of time that we've had the carbon technology, and it's been well developed, well established, and as we're building these plants as we speak. So technology-wise, I think there is no real question that we can move forward, and we should move forward very quickly. The bigger challenge here is, of course, that Ada and we will need to move forward at the same pace, because or else there will be, if there is no storage, then the capture side of this will be limited to those cases where we can actually utilize the CO2, and in the long run, the magnitude of that will not be a really climate action. So I think that's one of the key challenges that we see today, is that there are a lot of plans, but many of these plans are towards the later part of this decade as a first of a kind.
Yes.
And Sada and we've been discussing, we need to move those plans much earlier and start getting both capture and storage underway.
Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of the science behind it, I mean, apart from taking out some sulfur and nitrogen oxides from certain different processes, there's no real block. I mean, it works.
Absolutely, yeah, it works. And I think for those that have been following the CCS industry in Norway, we all know that it works. So we have visitors from all over the world testing their technology. So it's certainly nothing that is big barriers to actually scaling this up to a real size. So it's coming back to the fact that we need to get going with these projects, and they need to be large enough to actually make a difference.
Absolutely. It's a really good segue, because the next bit I want to talk about is sort of where are we now? This is the sort of where have we got to in terms of handling these industries right now? And of course, JC, sticking with you, there's a certain project in Norway. I mean, as a company, we have a history working with the Mongstad. Maybe a little bit, a few words around our history in terms of our test center and everything else.
Absolutely. So the history of CCS, of course, in Norway follows a bit like the history here in the UK as well. We were quite optimistic for a while, and then in 2008, 2009, and 10, and leading up to 2012, there was a lot of things to go around. So Aker was the first to capture CO2 here in the UK. We were the first to deliver the carbon capture of the Mongstad Technology Center in 2012, which has been very instrumental in order to develop technologies. Yeah. And now, of course, the Norwegian state has sanctioned the Longship project together with the Northern Lights project, which will then open up the carbon capture and storage project in Norway, which will be the first of its kind, and will then allow for people to deliver CO2 to offshore storage. And it's been really important to take that decision now to show that you can actually make that first step forward, and to show that it's safe and reliable and technology is there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've certainly seen with the announcement of the various cluster developments in the UK, it's a good collection of some hard to abate industries there are also really, certainly in terms of initial inquiries that we see is really chasing the story. I just want, in terms of the next few years, how can we accelerate this process? I mean, again, Anna, you mentioned some of the policy side of it. That's a really interesting point. I wouldn't mind going into that a bit more detail. So in terms of how can we make steel, cement, and these industries, how can we accelerate that process? And admittedly, storage, Edda's life and work, is going to be a very important point to enable that process to move. But from your policy side, what other areas do you think could be used to accelerate the process of working with these industries?
Yeah. Well, I think one important element is finance. So we're seeing different sustainable taxonomies popping up all over the world. And I think that is going to be instrumental in sort of like really getting those projects to hit the ground running. Yep. Because we need large investments in these projects. We're talking about billions per project. So it's and that is really an important element. I think we need to build a framework and policy that is enabling rather than sort of stopping developments from happening. I've seen front runners being sort of hitting a wall when dealing with EU policies because it's not sort of adjusted for innovation properly. So there's a couple of things to fix there. So yeah, I'm really hoping that some developments in the EU. So we're looking at this from a perspective of Brussels. So some elements that will change in the coming years that could enable these innovations and investments to happen, such as changes in the, good projects going into the Innovation Fund, the 10E, the sustainable finance taxonomy being done really well. So we have a golden standard for projects that are really delivering those emission reductions at scale. And ultimately also connecting the dots. I think clusters are an important element to this because these projects alone can't really survive if they're isolated somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So if we have CO2 transport and storage networks, it'll decrease costs as well substantially. So we need to connect all the dots around these hard to abate sectors to make them actually decarbonize.
Absolutely. Mark, anything to add to that on the policy side?
Yeah, I think we need to be clear that we need to focus on the climate impact of the different solutions that we can provide. So hydrogen, for example, how you make hydrogen needs to be connected to the carbon intensity of that production, not necessarily, the label that it has, but really just the carbon intensity, the electricity that went to power it, or the unabated or abated gas that went to create it. We need to, instead of focusing on the different colors that might exist, the rainbow of hydrogen, really just focusing on lowering the threshold of CO2 emissions from the production of hydrogen.
Yeah, fine, thank you. That's a good point. Edda, on the storage side, is it just finance that? You had a very nice EU grant recently, which is fantastic news. But is it finance? Is it policy support? What do you think you need to see, in particular, your storage concept to really move forward?
Well, it's both. Of course, we need finance like everybody else. And we got a grant from the Innovation Fund, which is great, but it's for one project, and we need much more, along with further developing the technology. For the policy side, I agree that there are still serious barriers there. And it's actually a shame that while we have been, some of us, developing new technologies, the policy hasn't been following at the same speed. So we are sort of stuck with regulations that were maybe written close to 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
So they are absolutely not up to date with the most recent technology. And we will see, hopefully, more expedited speed in further developing these technologies. So I think it's extremely important that policy get up to speed with the real climate action plans that we are implementing. For storage, I mentioned earlier that we have to start developing new sites. We have to do that quickly, but at the same time, we have to, of course, bring already developed sites to large scale. And of course, there are challenges there. So basically what we have to do is we have to pursue all these fronts at once, and we have to make sure that they sort of are internet connected, so that information from what we are doing going to scale is fed into policies, fed into new sites and so forth. So it's very exciting from an innovation aspect, but it's going to be a challenge. But I'm optimistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to hear. And JC, moving on, apart from just the innovation into the technical side and aimings and so on, and what about commercial innovation? I know we've taken a certain step in terms of the model we use. How has that really helped, or how could that really help these hard to abate sectors?
Well, I think we realized that this is not moving fast enough. So over a year ago, we sat down and said, how can we also move the commercial side of this to a better position where our clients can move forward with these first of kind projects much more easily? And this is where we came up with the carbon capture as a service, in a way, an ability for medium-sized emitter to take advantage of low-cost modular carbon capture plants, but at the same time also get that financed and a full value chain delivery together with partners in terms of so that the complexity of actually getting started with these type of projects is taken radically down. And we set ourselves a target, a very ambitious one, that we would make that viable already now, meaning that you can make that decision, even with all the uncertainty that are out there. There is uncertainty regarding the price of carbon. There's uncertainty regarding negative emissions and discussions around carbon reductions. There are a lot of uncertainties, but we wanted to have this offering, the as a service offering, so good that businesses can actually take that decision today. And we want to complement also these large-scale, one-of-a-kind projects that we were seeing being developed into those mid-scale modular ones. And this is why we've seen not only here in the UK with Viridor, and there are 5 plants where we're now looking at, modular plants that could actually enable those mid-scales, but all over Europe, a lot of interest coming to this carbon capture made easy, basically, where, capture companies and storage companies come together to enable projects today. And that's really commercial innovation, because it really addresses all the things that the client is really faced with when you're thinking about hard-to-abate industry.
Absolutely, and it's also maybe adding a channel for the money to get to the problem as well. I mean, certainly our experience is that actually there's quite a lot of funding out there. It might be not the right cost of capital. It might be coming from a fund that would rather find a $10 billion opportunity, not a $1 billion or a 100 million one, but there is money out there. So we can find a way to move that to the targets. We can certainly accelerate what's going on. Last question to everyone before we take some questions from the floor. That was your warning to think of one, by the way. Is just where would success be if we meet again in a few years' time at another COP? We look back, what would you like to have seen progress in this hard to abate area? And maybe Mark, maybe start with you.
Well, we need more Northern Lights type projects. We need a competitor for Northern Lights. So there can be more, just more access to CO2 storage, and for cheaper. So it needs to be quite easy for a point source to be able to send their CO2 to a storage site. So we also need to make sure that hard to abate sectors like cement and steel, there needs to be at least a handful of facilities that have shown that you can reduce the emissions from that facility to almost zero, or even to beyond, you can actually go carbon negative in some of these facilities. Only if you have access to storage and only if you use biogenic CO2. But if you combine those together, you can have an industry that is carbon negative, which produces output such as cement or steel. So I think we need to demonstrate that at a scale by 2030.
Absolutely. Anna, how about your wish list?
Yeah, it's a long one. But I would agree with Mark that basically seated transport and storage hubs are the thing that really needs to develop in the coming decades. In the coming decade, actually. But also, when we look at the big picture for hard to abate sectors, I think improving energy and material efficiency is still something that needs to be done. So we're constantly improving on efficiency, but we just need to strive for as much as we possibly can. Also, integrating more renewable electricity into the usage in hard to abate sectors is really important, and deploying that renewable electricity. Then the usage of truly low carbon hydrogen will also be one of the biggest sort of decarbonizing strategies for hard to abate sectors. And then at the end, I think counting all of that in a way which reflects the actual changes to the atmosphere is really important. So the fact that we pledge to climate neutrality is not, it doesn't mean anything unless we actually remove and mitigate that CO2.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark.
Build on that, and to go back to my point as well on carbon negative, that by 2030 we need to have a really good monitoring, reporting, and verification system for carbon, especially when it comes to the origin of the CO2 and the fate of the CO2. Those are the two most important things, as you were saying, to really see the impact on the climate.
Yeah, it's a very good point. JC.
Well, I think I would like to see much more policy in place to really accelerate the implementation of carbon capture and storage. And one example is now where we've been working with Microsoft to trace CO2 across the value chain in order to lay the foundation for negative emission and all the discussions around how we can incentivize some of the bio industries and other industries that have CO2. So I think the whole framework around acting now and getting started on the carbon capture and storage it needs to come much more. There needs to be more carrots, and there needs to be probably more sticks as well in order to accelerate this market. And then I'm thinking that every country should have a real clear strategy of what are the first of a kind projects, what are they how can they accelerate those so that we can see action not in 2030 but already in 2025.
Yeah. Very good point. Edda.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. And I think by 2030, I mean, we absolutely have to have proven at scale in all the hard to abate sectors, the concept and operational success of CCS. So that we are already starting a serious rollout phase throughout the world. So that's extremely important that we do that. Also, I agree that we have to, I mean, there are opportunities there. We can create synergies with utilization of CO2, with creating negative emissions. And this will allow the front runners, the businesses, to really take the lead in the market. So I hope that not by 2030, but by 2025, we will already see businesses competing sort of to take the lead, because there are so many opportunities in using waste heat to create negative emissions or you know, whatever. The opportunities are endless. So I really hope that we've seized the opportunities and as I said, are starting a serious rollout phase by 2030.
That's an excellent point. I think about my own personal view, if we meet in, let's say, 5 years' time, it would be great to look back and see some real examples of it working, rather than meeting. And so we have an even bigger opportunity set. Like, no, just get it working so you can dispel some of the doubt and move on. Great. Thank you, everyone. So we now have time for questions from the floor, if there are any. I know it's this time of day, 9:30 is probably going to do a little bit of a caffeine lull after your breakfast. But if there are any questions, then there is a microphone to throw around. Yes, we have a question right there. Okay.
Testing. Hiya, Edda. I was just interested in hearing about how transferable the storage that you're using in Iceland is across other countries. Really fascinating project.
Oh yeah, thank you for that question. I now realize I didn't say in my answers, but actually the basalt, the rock formation we have been mainly injecting in to date, is one of the most common rock types on Earth. We have it on all the continents, majority of the ocean floor as well. So the potential is big. It's on the order of hundreds of thousands of gigatons, the potential. And we are actively working on getting new projects up and running outside of Iceland. And the interest is big. If you want to have a close look at where the most favorable formations are, you can visit our website, carbfix.com/atlas. It shows you an interactive map that allows you sort of to travel around the world and see where do we have the point sources, where do we have the favorable storage site. And as I say, the potential is extremely big, not just for creating hubs for transporting CO2 over some distances, but also to locally capture and store the CO2 where we have point sources sitting right on top of or very close to a favorable storage site. So there is big potential there.
Thank you. Good question. Any more questions in the room? Yes. Now this may be a challenge given the length of the microphone. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much. It was super interesting. I don't really know very much about this topic, so apologize if this may be a stupid question, but are there potentially any impacts, especially for maybe big companies that have a lot of money that instead of them being incentivized to reduce emissions, they then therefore just say, oh, we can still keep emitting as much as we want because we can afford to pay for all our carbon storage?
I think I'll take that.
Please do.
So yeah, that's part of the problem with net zero. That's because it's between a balance of emissions and removals, the way that you sort of ascribe the credit for removing is quite important. But it will always be easier to capture from the source, from a point source, and to store it. And so obviously the point of carbon capture and storage is to make sure that the emissions from a facility are abated in the first place, so that they don't need to do offsetting. They don't need to pay for any other removals. And ideally, they do their own removals. So we can actually make hard to abate sectors not hard to abate, just helping other sectors to abate in a way, because they could be carbon negative. I'm not sure if that.
Actually, on that topic, one other angle. I mean, it's a good question, because actually, it's the easy questions are always fundamentally the hardest to answer. And you think of the issue of, okay, well, let's assume the ETS price, well, you think it's going to stay at 60, so I'm just going to pay it. So what happens? Well, look at the EU taxonomy. And if you're a public company, especially, but if you have to access the equity or debt market, you actually will likely pick up yellow flags in terms of that EU taxonomy structure. That means, firstly, some investors might not be able to own you if you still emit, if you have a plant making X, whatever that might be, hard to abate or not hard to abate. If you still have a CO2 footprint and you could have done something about it, but you don't, your ability to raise debt could be more challenged. You probably can't access the green bond market. So there's lots of the JC's going about carrot and stick. There's quite a lot of stick that's coming as well. And I think people don't like it, but I think this is one development that will be needed to see even more emphasis on to really push the story forward. And actually, oh, Mark, yeah.
Again, something else that's when it comes to carbon dioxide removal, negative emissions, one of the things we're working on is to make sure that the target for emission reductions is separate from the target for carbon dioxide removal, specifically so that they can't be mixed. So you can't offset instead of reducing emissions. So for the run up to 2050, that would be the ideal way to design this framework.
Absolutely, JC.
And adding back the Microsoft example, of course, this takes the whole thing to another level, because you can really look at this from the perspective of actually looking back into history. Can you actually do something with the history that you have already put out there? And that's what I like about the carbon removal discussion, is that you can take it one step further than just looking at, either capturing there or capturing there. It's actually looking into history and saying, okay, we at Microsoft or Google, we have actually emitted X over the last 20 years. We would like to do something about that, and we would like to start that market already now while waiting for the EU ETS system to be revised and other policies coming into place. And I think that effect that you get into the discussion is really, really important, because we need all those type of drivers now to get started with carbon capture and storage.
I have a question for Edda. And one hard to debate area we've not discussed is the atmosphere. And I know you have a very interesting link up with Climeworks, thank you. And in Iceland, looking at DAC, looking at direct air capture. I mean, how do you see that market developing?
Oh, it's a very interesting market. Lots of things happening, and it's extremely important that we are already now taking the first steps in implementing the technology, linking direct air capture to storage, proving that it can be done, because it's a fact that we need carbon removals at serious scale by mid-century. And if we're gonna bring the cost down to a reasonable number by then, we have to absolutely continue what we are doing now. It's another part of what COP26 does. We take CO2. It can be from hard to abate sectors. It can be from the atmosphere, and we inject it for permanent storage. And the direct air capture and storage market, it's extremely exciting. And just a few days ago, the US launched a very progressive support program for developing direct air capture and storage. I hope that Europe will do something along those lines, because otherwise the US will take the lead in not too long a time.
Absolutely, thank you. Any more questions in the room? Okay. I think that means everyone is already itching, thinking I have another 20 events to do today, and I don't know where they are when they start. So we have many miles to cover. So firstly, thank you so much to everyone on the panel for coming along today. Really appreciate your time and a good discussion, and thank you for giving up your time as well at these super busy events. And thank you all for turning up online as well as in the room. So thank you.